Appa. The word that stopped a police raid in its tracks came from the lips of a child who had never spoken a single sound. Not to her mother, not to the specialists, not to the world. But she spoke to him. Seoul's most lethal shadow, a man with ice for blood and a heart locked behind steel. She looked up at Park Min, placed her small hand against his cold weapon, and whispered the word that would dismantle his empire. Appa. Park Min is about to make a choice that will change Korea forever. Subscribe now so you never miss a chapter of this redemption. Rose David's world tilted on its axis the moment she looked at the empty chair in the patient's room. 1 second, Helen was there, playing with her wooden blocks. The next? Only silence. A silence that screamed. This wasn't their small apartment in Itaewon, this was the Park Fortress. A labyrinth of marble where the monster conducted his business and where children were strictly, lethally forbidden. Panic turned Rose's blood to ice. She had 1 hour before the shift change. 1 hour to find a silent child in a house full of men who were paid to notice everything. She slipped into the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was moving into the dead zone, the 3rd floor, where she had been warned that one wrong step meant disappearing. She had no choice. Her child was wandering toward a monster, and the police were already at the gates. The crate was never meant for a child. It was meant for 4 drips, sterile bandages, rolls of gauze, the kind of cold, lifeless things that didn't breathe, didn't whimper, didn't occasionally forget that their entire existence depended on silence. But Helen was 3 years old, and 3-year-olds don't understand that some rules aren't just rules. Some rules are sentences. Rose had rehearsed this moment 100 times. She'd measured the crate. She'd practiced breathing exercises with Helen the night before, turning it into a game. Hold your breath like we're underwater, baby, hold it until mommy says swim. She'd lined the inside with a folded blanket so the rattling wouldn't echo. She had thought of everything. What she hadn't thought of was guard Kim. New guards were dangerous because they still had something to prove. As the supply truck rolled up to the Park Estate's iron gate, Rose watched him through the windshield and felt her stomach drop. He wasn't waving them through. He was walking toward them. Medical delivery, Rose said, keeping her voice professionally bored. Kim didn't answer. He moved to the back of the truck. Rose heard the doors swing open. Heard his boots on the metal floor. Heard him stop right next to the crate. Then the most catastrophic sound in the world. Helen was starting to cough. Rose didn't think. She collapsed to the ground, clutching her chest, gasping, screaming, making herself the emergency. It worked. Kim spun around, radioed for help, forgot the crate entirely. 20 minutes later, Rose sat in the estate's medical bay, Helen hidden 2 floors above in a supply closet, both of them breathing again. But as Rose stared at the ceiling, one thought wouldn't leave her alone. Kim had looked at that crate for a long time before she screamed. What if he remembered? Rose had one rule for Helen above everything else. One rule that mattered more than be quiet, more than don't move, more than pretend you don't exist. The rule was simple: stay in the room. Helen lasted 4 hours. It was the ink that did it. A small bottle had tipped over during the supply delivery, leaving a thin blue trail that crept under the door and into the hallway like something alive, something beckoning. And Helen, who had her mother's curiosity and absolutely none of her caution, had followed it the way children follow things that shimmer, without thinking, without stopping, without any concept of what waited at the end. The East Wing was forbidden. Every member of staff knew it. No one cleaned there. No one walked there after dark. The rumors about what Park Min had done to the last person who wandered in uninvited were so varied and so vicious that people had simply stopped questioning which version was true. Helen thought it smelled like old paper and rain. She padded down the corridor in her socks, the ink trail thinning, the lights dimming, until she pushed open a heavy door and found herself standing in a room full of shadows and silence and one man sitting very, very still. Park Min didn't hear her come in. He was staring at a photograph on his desk, his jaw tight, his scarred hands flat against the wood like he was trying to hold the desk down or hold himself together, it was impossible to tell which. The woman in the photograph was smiling. He was not. Helen walked up to the desk. She studied the photograph for a moment with the grave seriousness only small children can manage. Then she reached out and placed her tiny hand directly on top of his scarred one. Park Min's entire body went rigid. He turned his head slowly, the way a man turns when he's certain he must be hallucinating, and looked down at the child standing beside him like she belonged there. Neither of them moved. 2 floors below, Rose had just finished with the patient, wiped her hands, and turned to go check on Helen. The supply closet was empty. The door was open. And in the hallway, faint but unmistakable, was a trail of blue ink leading east. Park Min had not survived 28 years by being soft. He had survived by being faster than sentiment, colder than circumstance, and absolutely unmoved by things that were designed to move people. He had built walls around himself that architects couldn't draw and armies couldn't breach. He was, by every account that mattered, unreachable. He reached for the phone. Security would handle this quietly. They always did. Whatever this child was doing here, whoever had smuggled her in, it would be resolved efficiently and without emotion, and he would go back to his photograph and his silence and his carefully constructed life of nothing. His finger touched the call button. And Helen looked up at him. Not with fear. Not with the wide, animal panic of a child who understands danger. She looked at him the way children look at things they've already decided belong to them, with total, devastating ownership. Her eyes moved to the photograph of the woman on his desk. Then back to him. Then she opened her mouth. The word she said was barely a sound. A breath with shape. A whisper so small it should have dissolved before it reached him. Appa. Daddy. Park Min's finger never pressed the button. His whole body simply stopped. Like something internal had blown a fuse. Like the word had walked straight through every wall he'd ever built and sat down in the middle of the rubble like it lived there. The door crashed open. Rose stood in the frame, chest heaving, face white as bone, fully prepared for the worst moment of her life. What she found instead was the most feared man in Seoul, sitting completely still, staring at a 3-year-old girl with an expression she had never seen on any human face before. It looked terrifyingly close to wonder. Rose didn't move. Didn't speak. But her mind was already screaming one question she had no answer for. Why did Helen, who had never spoken a single word in 3 years of life, choose him? Rose had prepared for rage. She had prepared for threats, for handcuffs, for the kind of cold, corporate fury that men like Park Min deployed the way other people used punctuation, precisely, and without remorse. She had prepared for the worst night of her life. She had not prepared for him to say, quietly and without looking up, have their belongings moved to the East Suite. The silence that followed was so complete that Rose could hear her own heartbeat misfiring. I'm sorry, she managed. You heard me. Park Min finally looked at her, and his expression was not fury. It was something far more unsettling, it was certainty. Like a decision had already been made in a room she hadn't been invited to. The child stays. Which means you stay. Security reasons. Security reasons. Rose turned those 2 words over in her mind like stones that didn't quite fit the hole they were meant to fill. It happened the next morning. His head of security, a man named Beck who had survived 5 years in Park Min's orbit through sheer ruthlessness, made the mistake of raising his voice when Helen wandered into the corridor unattended. He didn't shout. He barely even snapped. But Park Min appeared from nowhere, and what he said to Beck was so quiet, so surgical, so absolute, that the man cleaned out his office before lunch. 5 years. Gone because he startled a child. Rose watched it happen and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This wasn't protection. This was obsession wearing protection's clothes. And obsession, in a man like Park Min, was more dangerous than hatred. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that 3 miles away, a police task force had just pulled a still image from the estate's external cameras. The woman in the photograph was Rose. and the detective holding it was smiling. Nobody had ever seen Park Min sit on the floor before. His staff walked past the half-open door, stopped, looked, and kept walking with the careful urgency of people who had decided very firmly that they had seen nothing. Because what they had seen made no sense, and things that made no sense in this house had a way of becoming dangerous if you looked at them too long. Park Min was sitting cross-legged on the floor in a suit that cost more than most people's cars, a bowl of tea between him and Helen, watching her with the focused intensity he usually reserved for hostile boardroom negotiations. Helen picked up a piece, examined it with absolute seriousness, and popped it into her mouth. Park Min did the same. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither smiled. It was, somehow, the warmest thing Rose had ever witnessed. She watched from the doorway as he leaned forward and demonstrated, shoulders back, jaw set, eyes forward, the expression of a man who had learned very young that stillness was armor. Helen studied his face and copied it with eerie precision. Something flickered across Park Min's expression then. Not quite a smile. Something more fragile than a smile. Recognition. Rose turned away because watching it felt like trespassing. She almost didn't feel the phone buzz in her pocket. The message had no name attached. Just a number she didn't recognize and 6 words that rearranged every organ in her body. "We know about the girl. Meet us." She stepped outside, hands shaking, and called back. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and absolutely merciless. "Help us dismantle Park Min's operation," it said, "or we take your daughter into state custody tonight." Rose looked back through the window at Helen mimicking a monster's stillness. And said nothing. Rose spent 48 hours trying to find a third option. There wasn't one. She couldn't give the police what they wanted. She'd seen enough of Park Min's operation to know that dismantling it meant bodies, and some of those bodies would belong to people who had been kind to her. She couldn't stay silent either, because the detective had texted again that morning with a photograph. Helen at the window. Taken from outside the gate. Meaning someone had been watching close enough to frame her face. That was not surveillance. That was a threat with a timestamp. She found Park Min in the library at midnight, which was apparently where he went when the house got too quiet and his thoughts got too loud. He didn't look up when she entered. She sat across from him anyway, and for a long moment she said nothing, because once she started she couldn't unknow where this conversation would land. Then she told him everything. She didn't dress it up. No softening, no strategy, just the raw, ugly shape of it. The police contact. The ultimatum. The way they'd spoken about Helen like she was a bargaining chip with a pulse. By the time she finished, her face was wet and her hands were shaking and she was braced for the coldness she'd seen him deploy like a weapon. It didn't come. Park Min set down his book. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that meant something was happening beneath the surface that he had no language for yet. "They photographed her," he said quietly. "Yes." He stood up. "Then they've made their choice." Rose exhaled, and then her phone lit up on the table between them. A message from the detective, *grade authorized. 6 a.m. *. It was currently 1 a.m. The first flashbang hit at 5:58 a.m. Not 6. 5:58, because the detective was the kind of man who liked to take things 2 minutes before you were ready for them. Rose had not slept. She'd spent the 5 hours between that message and this moment helping Park Min's team move documents, secure exits, and prepare for a scenario nobody had a clean answer for. She'd done all of it with Helen strapped to her back in a makeshift carrier because she was never, not for 1 second, letting go of her daughter again. That was the plan. The explosion that took out the east corridor wall was not part of the plan. The force of it threw Rose sideways into a doorframe and the world turned white and ringing and wrong. She reached for Helen's hand, she was almost certain she had Helen's hand, and then there was another blast, closer, and the smoke came in like a living thing, thick and chemical and absolute, and when Rose's vision cleared enough to matter she was on the floor and the carrier was empty and the corridor was full of shouting men in tactical gear and she couldn't see Helen. She couldn't see Helen. Rose screamed her daughter's name into the smoke and heard nothing back. She crawled forward on her hands and knees through the debris, through the chaos of boots and shouting and the crack of gunfire somewhere above her, and she screamed again and again until her voice broke. Park Min's guards were fighting. Glass was falling. Somewhere an alarm had been shrieking for so long it had become indistinguishable from silence. And then, from deep inside the smoke, from somewhere small and low to the ground, came a sound. Not a scream. Not a cry. One word. Appa. The courtyard was the end of the line and Park Min knew it. He'd known it the moment the eastern perimeter fell. He'd run the calculations the way he always did, exits, angles, probabilities, and the numbers had come back with the same answer every time. There was no version of this that ended well. There were only versions that ended faster. 12 SWAT officers had him in a semicircle, rifles up, rain coming down in sheets, and Park Min stood with his back to the courtyard wall holding his weapon with the steady hands of a man who had already made his peace with the arithmetic of the situation. He had one shot at this. Maybe two. He was raising his arm when he heard the door. It wasn't a crash. It wasn't a shout. It was just the small, specific sound of a handle turning, and then Helen was there, in the rain, in her socks, in the oversized estate shirt she'd been sleeping in, standing in the middle of the courtyard like she'd simply followed the noise until she found the person she was looking for. She looked at the rifles. She looked at Park Min. Then she walked toward him, directly through the no man's land between the guns and the man they were pointed at, and she stopped in front of him and spread her small arms wide. Just like that. A 3-year-old standing in the rain with her arms out, shielding a man an entire city was afraid of. Appa, she said. Quiet this time. Certain. Park Min looked down at her. The gun in his hand had never felt heavier. He looked at the rifles. Looked at her face. Looked at the choice laid out before him with brutal, perfect clarity. He set the weapon on the ground. And somewhere behind him, Rose heard the detective's voice crack when he gave the order to hold fire, the voice of a man who had not expected to feel anything tonight, and was furious that he did. Park Min raised both hands. But as the officers moved in and the cuffs came out, he looked directly at the lead detective with an expression that made 3 armed men instinctively step back. Whatever happens to me, he said quietly, she stays with her mother. It wasn't a request. The detective stared at him for a long moment in the rain. Then looked away first. They put the handcuffs on him in the rain, in front of his own gates, in front of every camera that had scrambled to the scene because men like Park Min don't get arrested quietly. The story would be everywhere by morning. The headlines were already writing themselves, crime boss falls, clean, satisfying, the kind of ending that looks good in a press conference and means absolutely nothing to anyone who was actually there. None of the reporters wrote down what had really happened inside. None of them noted that during the worst of the raid, when the smoke was thickest and the crossfire most dangerous, Park Min had not moved toward an exit. He had moved toward the sound of a child. That he had found Helen behind a collapsed shelf and covered her body with his until the shooting stopped. That when Rose finally reached them, her daughter was asleep against the chest of the most feared man in Seoul, and a scarred hand was pressed gently over her ear so she couldn't hear the guns. They didn't write that part down. But the detective saw it. And something in his face changed in a way he would spend a long time pretending hadn't happened. As they walked Park Min toward the vehicle, he turned once, just once, and found Helen in the crowd. The little girl raised her hand in a small, grave wave. And Park Min, in handcuffs, in the rain, with half the city watching, smiled. A real one. The kind that doesn't know how to perform itself, the kind that only surfaces on faces that have kept it buried for decades too long. It was the most dangerous thing anyone had ever seen him do. Because it was real. 6 months later, the apartment was small and warm and impossibly full of light. Helen had a window seat she treated like a kingdom. A shelf of books she couldn't read yet but handled with solemn reverence. A jade plant she watered every single morning, Her small face set with the same focused intensity she'd once used to study a scarred man eating teok on the floor of his own fortress. The trust had been arranged before the arrest. Lawyers Rose had never met. Paperwork she hadn't requested. An account that covered rent, food, school fees, and asked for nothing, no conditions, no strings, no debt. Just the last, quiet act of a man who had decided, somewhere between a shared bowl of snacks and a rainy courtyard standoff, that someone else's life was worth more than his own freedom. Rose was making tea the morning she heard it. Not words at first. Just sound, soft and wandering and completely unguarded, the way children sing when they've forgotten the world is listening. She set her cup down and stood very still in the doorway because she was terrified that if she moved, it would stop. Helen was in her window seat, jade plant cradled in both hands, singing to it. A small invented song with no real melody and no real words, just pure, effortless sound shaped into something that felt, against all odds, like joy. Rose pressed her hand to her mouth. Because Helen had never sung before. Helen had barely spoken before a broken man in a dark office had accidentally shown her that some silences are worth ending. On the shelf, propped against the unread books, was a photograph Helen had found in a box and placed there herself, deliberately, carefully, in the spot she'd decided it belonged. Parkman unsmiling. Formidable. Present. Watching over the room like a man who'd made a promise and intended to keep it from whatever distance the world allowed him. A monster walked into this story. He didn't walk out as one. It didn't take a grand revelation. It took a 3-year-old girl with her arms outstretched in the rain, and one word, and the absolute refusal to believe that the person in front of her was beyond saving. That's what we do here at Mafia World Stories, we find the human being buried inside the legend. We tell the stories that the headlines always get wrong. If this one got under your skin, if you believe that the worst thing a person has done doesn't have to be the last thing they are, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to Mafia World Stories and turn on the notification bell, because the next story is already coming, and it starts in a place even darker than this one. And it ends somewhere no one will see coming. Don't miss it.